Della Hargrove buried her husband on a Tuesday, and by Sunday the church had a new name for her. She came in and took her pew. Same as 12 years running. Third, from the front on the left, under the window where the morning light came in yellow. She'd sat there through 2 babies she never got to keep, and one she buried before it drew breath. She'd sat there beside Tom every Sunday of their marriage. That Sunday, another family sat in it. A wife and 4 scrubbed children, and a husband who would not meet her eye. The deacon had given her pew away and told no one. Della stood in the aisle a moment. She did not weep. She did not make a sound. She nodded once, the way a woman nods when a horse has finally shown her what it truly is, and she turned and walked out the back into the cold. By the next week it was worse. She went to the mercantile for flour and thread. 40 churchgoers stood about the counter in their Sunday best, and the deacon's wife looked her up and down like a stain on a clean floor, and she said it plain for all of them to hear. A woman that wild answers to no man. No decent outfit will ride behind her. And Elias Poole's storekeeper, ashamed but obedient, turned Della's account in the ledger and drew a line under her name and marked it closed. She had $2 in her coat. She paid for the flour and left the thread. But there was a man in the doorway that morning. Broad through the shoulders, gray coming in at the temples, dust on him like he'd ridden hard and slept in his saddle. He watched a wagon team spook at the mercantile hitch rail, 2 full-grown men hauling on the lines and cursing and getting nowhere, the horses climbing near out of their traces. And he watched Della Hargrove set down her flour and cross the street and put one hand flat on the near horse's neck and say something low that no one else could hear. 10 seconds. The team stood like they'd been poured out of lead. The man said nothing. But he was short a trail boss, and the pass would snow shut in 5 weeks, and he did not forget a thing like that. If you believe love is built with 2 pairs of hands, this story is for you. I'm the voice you're going to ride the next hour with. So if a story about a woman the whole world got wrong is the kind you stay for, do this before we go on. Tap subscribe. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this drive travels before we're through. Go on. I'll wait right here. Now, let me tell it the way it happened. Harlow Crossing sat in a bend of the Alder River in the Wyoming Territory. And in the fall of that year, the cottonwoods along the water had gone the color of a struck match. It was a small town. A church and a bank and a mercantile and a livery and a scatter of houses, and the ranches spread out wide around it like spokes off a bad wheel. Everybody knew everybody. That was the trouble with it. A place like that has a long memory and a short heart. Della Hargrove kept a spread of 8 acres 2 miles out, on land she and Tom had scraped together over 12 years. A cabin, a soddy for the winter feed, a pole corral she'd built half of herself. And 3 horses. That was all she had left in the world now, 3 horses and 8 acres, and a name the town had turned into a curse. She broke colts for her living. She was the best hand with a green horse in that whole county, and every man in it knew it, and not one of them would pay her full price. They'd bring her the outlaws, the rearers and the biters, and the ones that had thrown a boy and busted a collarbone. The horses nobody else could gentle. She'd take them into her corral, and she'd work them slow, day on day, with a patience that looked from the road like doing nothing at all. And in 3 weeks, she'd hand back an animal that would follow a child. And the man would count out 2/3 of what he'd have paid a man to do the same, and he'd grumble at even that, and he'd ride off and tell the fellows at the livery that the widow Hargrove was getting above herself. She heard it. She heard all of it. She kept her chin level and her voice even, and she did not give them the satisfaction of a single flinch. That was part of what they hated. A woman was supposed to break. She wouldn't. They called her Wild. I'll tell you the truth of that name before we're through, and it isn't what you think. But that fall, if you'd asked anyone in Harlow Crossing, They'd have told you the widow Hargrove was hard as a hame and twice as cold, and that her husband Tom, God rest him, had drowned on a cattle drive 2 years back, and that some folks said, if you leaned close, that she'd had a hand in it, that she was the kind of woman trouble followed home, that a man who rode with her would come back wet and cold or not come back at all. None of them had leaned close enough to hear what actually happened at the Sabinaw. But we'll get there. Hold that. Here is the kind of woman she really was. There was a boy on the neighboring place, the Ashby boy, maybe 9 years old, and he had a fat little pony he loved past all sense. And one night in early October the pony foundered, got into the grain bin, and gorged itself sick, the way they will, and by dark it was down in the yard groaning and blowing and hot in all 4 feet. The Ashbys had cut Della dead in the street not 2 weeks before. The mother had gathered her skirts aside like Della carried a fever. But the father came to her corral at 11 o'clock that night with a lantern, because there was no one else in 20 miles who could save that pony. And he knew it, and swallowing his pride near choked him. Della didn't make him say much. She got her coat and her satchel, and she went. She was in the Ashby yard till near dawn. She walked that pony when it needed walking, and she got warm water into it, and she stood in the cold, with her hand on its belly, reading the gut the way another woman reads a letter. She talked to the boy, who wouldn't leave, and she told him it wasn't his fault, though it half was, and she told him the pony was strong and had a mean streak, and a mean streak was a thing that kept an animal alive. Along about first light the pony passed what it needed to pass, and its feet cooled, and it lifted its head and looked at the boy like nothing at all had happened. Della wouldn't take a dime. The man tried to press it on her, and she folded his hand shut around his own money, and she said the boy's face was pay enough, which was true, and she walked home 2 miles in the frost. And the next afternoon she passed Mrs. Ashby on the road into town, and Mrs. Ashby lifted her chin and looked straight through her like she was a fence post, like the night before had never come, like Della's hands hadn't been inside that pony to the wrist. That was Harlow Crossing. They'd take the good of her in the dark and deny they knew her in the light. Della drove on into town that same day, and she did not let one thing show on her face. But I'll tell you, because you should know it, and they never did, that she cried the whole 2 miles home. Alone. Where no one could bank it against her. She had learned that much. Grief you show in that town, they'd find a way to charge you for. Now, while all this is going, there's a man across the valley with troubles of his own, and his troubles and hers are about to run into each other and change the shape of both. His name was Amos Ridgeway. He owned the Two Bells, the biggest outfit in that country, land his grandfather had bled for, and his father had bled for, and that he had bled for himself. 3 generations sunk into that grass and that creek. Good water on the Two Bells. Best in the valley. A creek that ran when everything else went to dust in August. That creek was the whole reason the ranch was worth anything, and it was the whole reason Amos was about to lose it. Because the Two Bells was in debt. $3,150 in debt, to be exact, to the Alder Valley Stock and Loan. Bad years stacked on bad years, a hard winter that killed calves in the drifts, a dry summer that burned the high pasture, a market that fell out from under the beef just when he had beef to sell. It happens to good men. It had happened to Amos. And the note was coming due. The man who held that note was Silas Corwin, president of the Alder Valley Stock and Loan, and I want you to look close at Silas Corwin, because he is not the kind of villain who shouts. He was a courteous man, 50-some, soft-handed, always in a clean coat, always a kind word on his lips like sugar over strychnine. He would tip his hat to your wife. He would ask after your children by name, and he was, quietly and legally and with a smile, buying up half the ruined ranches in that valley off the courthouse steps for pennies on the acre when the notes came due. He wanted the Two Bells, not the buildings, not the cattle, the creek. That good water that ran all year. With that creek in his pocket, he'd control the whole lower valley, and every rancher below it would water at his say-so and pay for the privilege. He'd figured it to the penny. He always had. So the note read this way: if Amos Ridgeway did not deliver his fall herd, 1,100 head, to the railhead at Dunmore Station and sell it and bring the money to the loan office by the 18th of October, the note called. And the ranch and the creek went to Corwin. 1,100 head, 200 miles of trail, and Coldwater Pass, the only way over the mountains to Dunmore, snowed shut every year sometime in late October and did not open again till spring. Amos had 5 weeks, maybe less if the weather turned early. It was tight, but it could be done. Men did it every fall. Except Amos had no trail boss. His foreman was a man named Wick Tanner, 55 years old, been with the Two Bells since Amos was a boy, and Wick was going to boss that drive same as he'd bossed a dozen. And then, 10 days before they were to pull out, a green 3-year-old that Wick was topping off went over backward in the corral and came down on him, and when they pulled the horse off, Wick's hip was broke in 2 places. He'd live. He'd walk again, with a stick, in a year. But he would not sit a saddle for 200 miles that fall or any fall after. And that left Amos Ridgeway with 1,100 head to move, 5 weeks to move them, $3,100 and his family's land riding on it, and not one man to boss the drive. He'd tried. Understand that, before you judge what he did next. He'd ridden the whole county. Every reputable trailman was already gone north with the big outfits, or worse, already drawing wages from Silas Corwin, who had quietly hired up every free hand he could find for exactly this reason. Corwin didn't need to do a thing. But wait. The snow would boss the drive for him. Amos was standing at the corral rail with Wick, who was propped on a chair with his busted hips stretched out and his face gray, and the two of them were staring at the problem like staring might solve it. And Wick, who'd known Della Hargrove's husband and known the truth of a thing the town had gotten wrong, said a strange thing, half to himself, looking at nothing. "You know," Wick said. "Only rider in this county ever brought a herd across the Sabinaw at flood was Tom Hargrove's outfit. Year of the big water." Amos grunted. "Tom Hargrove's been dead 2 years. That he has." Wick worked his jaw. "And it weren't Tom holding point when they crossed. But that's another story." And he let it drop, just like that, one line thrown away over a corral rail, and went on to something else. Amos didn't catch the weight of it. Neither did you, maybe. Let it sit. It comes back. But the seed was planted, and a day later, Wick planted it plainer. "Boss," he said, "you got one hand in this country can move that herd, and you know it and I know it, and the whole town'll spit blood over it. It's the Hargrove woman." Amos stared at him. "She can outride any man you ever hired," Wick said. "She can read stock better'n me. She can gentle a spooked animal quicker than you can spit. You want them cattle at Dunmore by the 18th? She's the one that'll do it. There ain't a second name to give you. There's her or there's nobody. The town'd never stand for it." "The town ain't got 1,100 head to sell," Wick said. "You do." And that was where it sat when Amos rode into Harlow Crossing on the very morning the deacon's wife closed Della's credit, and stood in the mercantile doorway and watched a woman the whole town had thrown away put one hand on a runaway team and turn it to stone. He followed her out. She was loading her flour into a battered wagon at the rail, and she felt him behind her before he spoke. She had that, a way of knowing where a thing was without looking, and she turned with her chin already up and her guard already set, because a man behind her in that town rarely meant anything good. "Mrs. Hargrove," Amos said. He took his hat off. That surprised her, though she didn't let it show. Not many men took their hats off to her anymore. Mr. Ridgeway, she knew who he was. Everyone did. "I'll come straight at it," he said. "I've got a herd to move, and no man to boss it. 1,100 head to Dunmore Station, over Coldwater, and I've got till the 18th or I lose my ranch. Every trail man in this country spoke for. Wick Tanner says you're the best hand in the valley. He turned his hat in his hands. I'm inclined to believe him. For a long moment she said nothing at all. She looked at him the way she looked at a green horse, measuring whether the thing in front of her would hold or break, whether it meant what it showed. She had been offered things by men before. Most of them she'd have washed her hands after. You know what they call me, she said finally. I heard what they called you not 10 minutes ago. In there. He nodded at the mercantile, in front of 40 people. I heard it. And you're standing here anyway. I've got a note coming due, Amos said, and a busted foreman, and a mountain that's fixing to close. I don't have the luxury of caring what the deacon's wife thinks. I need the best, and by every account the best is you. That's the whole of it. It wasn't quite the whole of it. But it was true as far as it went, and Della could hear that it was true, and it had been a long time since a man had told her anything true. He reached into his saddlebag and drew out a thing wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it there at the rail. It was a tally book, the trail boss's book, the ledger where the count is kept and the wages are set, and the whole drive is written down day by day. It was Wick's book, and old Ballard's before him, and it was worn soft as a glove at the corners, with 30 years of handling. It was the most important object on any drive. Whoever held that book held the herd. Amos held it out to her. 40 a month, he said. You answer to me. The herd answers to you. Della looked at the book. She did not take it right off. She knew, better than he did, maybe, exactly what taking it would cost her. It would light the whole town on fire. It would give every soul who'd ever whispered about her a torch. A woman bossing a men's drive. There was no scandal in that country to match it. But she also knew what refusing it would cost her, which was everything she was. She was a horsewoman. She was the best hand in the valley, and she'd been made to break outlaw ponies for 2/3 pay and pretend to be grateful. And here was a man holding out the one thing she was actually built for. Holding it out plain, in the daylight, on the main street, where anyone could see. She took the book. Her hand closed over it, and she felt the soft, worn cloth of it, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 2 years eased half an inch. The 18th, she said. The 18th. Then we don't have a day to waste, and you've already wasted 10. She tucked the book inside her coat, against her heart, where it stayed. I'll want to see your remuda tomorrow at first light, and your hands, and your gear. Tell me now, how many of your men'll ride under me? Amos was quiet a beat too long. That's what I thought, Della said, and she climbed up onto her wagon and gathered her lines and looked down at him, and for just a second, just one, there was something in her face that wasn't armor. You're a fool, Mr. Ridgeway, so I'm told. Then we'll get along. And she clucked to her team and drove out. Now here is the morning it all came due, and I want you to see it, because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. The drive was to form up on the main street of Harlow Crossing at dawn, gather the last of the gear and the chuck wagon, and push the herd out of the 2 Bells holding pasture south of town, and start the long climb toward Coldwater. Word had gone round, the way word does, that the Ridgeway drive was pulling out, and that the widow Hargrove was bossing it. By the time the gray light came up, half the town had found a reason to be on the street. In their coats, arms crossed, breath smoking. Come to watch. There is nothing a small town loves like a public reckoning, and they smelled one coming. The deacon's wife stood on the church steps in her good bonnet, and beside her, in his clean coat, with his soft hands folded, stood Silas Corwin, who had ridden in special from the loan office to see this, because Silas Corwin liked to watch his money ripen. And the hands Amos had hired stood in a knot by the chuck wagon, and you could see it in them before a word was said. the set of their shoulders. The way they looked at Della when she rode up on her tall bay gelding with the tally book in her coat, and looked away, and looked at each other. Della swung down and she did not waste breath. "We're burning daylight," she said. "Load the last of it and let's move. Who's got the point strings saddled?" And a big hand named Dyer, who'd bossed men before and thought he ought to be bossing this drive, spat in the dirt at her feet. "I don't ride behind no woman," he said. The street went quiet. You could hear the chuck wagon fire ticking. "Then don't," Della said. "Level, not loud. The gate's behind you. Good luck finding a fall drive that's still hiring." "You won't get 20 mile, Dyer said. "You won't get 'em over the first river." He raised his voice for the crowd, because that's who he was really talking to. "This is a fool's errand, and I ain't dying on it to make some widow feel like a man." And he threw down the saddle he was holding and walked off toward the crowd, and 3 men peeled off and went with him. Then a 4th. Then, after a shamed pause, a 5th. 5 of them. Gone, just like that, in front of the whole town. Corwin, on the church steps, smiled his soft smile. That was when he came down. He crossed the street in his clean coat, unhurried, a man with all the time in the world, and he stopped a polite 10 feet from Della and Amos, and he tipped his hat to her. Which was the cruelest thing he could have done, that courtesy, and he spoke, and he pitched it just loud enough to carry. "A woman that wild answers to no man. Ridgeway," he said it gently, almost sorrowful, "and no man will answer to her. You've seen it now with your own eyes." He glanced at the herd bawling in the holding pasture, at the too few hands left standing. "I'll buy your creek off the courthouse steps by Christmas. I'll try to be fair about the price for old time's sake." He tipped his hat again. "Good luck to you both, truly." And he turned and walked back to the church steps to watch them fail. Amos's jaw was working. His hand had gone to a fist. Every eye in that town was on him, and he could feel the old thing rising in him, the thing that measured himself by their regard, that wanted more than anything to explain himself to them, to make them understand. And it was in that moment, watching him nearly break under their looking, that Della understood the man she'd hired herself to. His blind spot. He still cared what they thought. It would nearly cost them everything before it was done. But Della didn't care what they thought. Not anymore. She had cried her last 2 miles about that town. She took the tally book out of her coat. She sat down on the tailgate of the chuck wagon, in front of the whole street, in front of Corwin and the deacon's wife and every soul who'd named her, and she opened the book and licked her pencil and she began, in a clear, steady hand, to write down wages. "You," she said to the 6 men who'd stayed, hard, quiet men, mostly older, the kind who'd seen enough of life to know a good hand from a loud one. Names, one at a time. And she wrote them down, 40 a month, fair and square, in the book. And then she looked at the ragged edge of the crowd where the boys stood, the ones nobody else would hire, green kids, 16 and 17, too young or too poor or too green for a real outfit to take on, who'd been standing there hoping and expecting nothing. 4 of them. "You 4, Della said. "You want to work?" They came forward like they couldn't believe it. And the first of them, first in line, was a raw-boned boy of 17 with a cowlick and a borrowed hat too big for him, and he stood in front of her with his heart in his throat. "Name," she said. "Cole." "Ma'am." "Cole Buckley." She wrote it down. Cole Buckley. 30 a month, green wages, honest, and the boy looked at his name in that book like it was written in gold. 10 hands, all told, 6 men and 4 boys, to move 1,100 head 200 miles over a closing mountain, against a man with a bank and a grudge and the whole town at his back. Della closed the book and stood up. "All right," she said. "We're short-handed, and we're late, and the whole town thinks we're dead already." She swung up onto her bay. Let's go prove 'em wrong. Cole, you and the boys take the drag. Mind the tired ones and the young ones and holler if a cow drops back. The rest of you know your work. Move 'em out." And they did. 10 riders and a cook, pushing a river of cattle south out of Harlow Crossing, while half the town watched and said not a word, and Silas Corwin watched from the church steps with his hands folded, patient as the winter. They were 3 days out when the sky tried to kill them the first time. It had been a good 3 days, which is to say a hard one, which on a drive is the same thing. The herd had strung out and settled into the plod. The men had stopped watching Della to see her fail and started watching her because she was worth watching. The way she sat a horse, the way she'd ride the whole line twice a day and know every animal in it, the way she never raised her voice and never had to. But they hadn't given her their hearts yet. Not near. A man'll take orders from a hand he doubts, if the pay's fair. Giving her more than that would take something bigger. It came on the third night. The air had been wrong all evening, heavy and green tasting, and the cattle were restless, milling and bawling, refusing to bed down easy. Della felt it in her own skin. She doubled the night watch and told the men to sing to the herd, keep them gentled, and she did not go to her own blankets. She sat her horse at the edge of the bedded cattle in the dark, and she waited, because she knew what that air meant. Along about midnight, the storm broke. Not rain, at first, just the lightning, hard and close and blue-white, cracking the whole sky open, and then a peal of thunder that came down like the mountain falling, and 1,100 head came up off the ground all at once and ran. There is nothing on this earth like a stampede in the dark. The ground shakes. You cannot see. You cannot hear anything but the roar of it. 4,000 hooves, and any man caught in front of it dies. The green boys froze. 2 of the men lost their heads and started riding the wrong way, trying to get ahead of the leaders on the outside, which is how a rider gets himself killed, and the herd gets itself scattered over 10 miles of dark prairie. And into that black chaos rode Della Hargrove. She didn't ride around it. She rode into it, up along the running edge of the herd, cutting in toward the front, toward the lead steers driving the whole thing forward, right into the deadly heart of it, where one stumble would put her under 2,000 animals. Cole Buckley, clinging to his horse at the drag, watched her disappear into the dark and the dust, and was sure he'd just watched a woman die. But Della knew a thing the panicked men didn't. You don't stop a stampede. You turn it. You get to the leaders and you bend them, and you keep bending them, until the whole herd is running in a circle, chasing its own tail, and a circle can't run anywhere, and a circle winds down. And she did it in the dark, with the lightning cracking over her head. She got up alongside those led steers, and she began to turn them, leaning her horse into them. And this is the part Cole never forgot, that none of them ever forgot. She began to sing. Low, steady, a hymn, of all things, the same one they'd have sung in the church that threw her out, sung soft, and even into the roar as though she had all the time in the world and no fear in her at all. And the leaders felt the pressure of her and heard that low, steady sound where everything else was chaos, and they began to bend, and the herd bent behind them, and the great deadly straight line of it curved, and closed into a circle, and the circle tightened and slowed, and the running wound down into a milling, and the milling wound down into a stand, and the cattle stood in the settling dust, blowing and trembling, and it was over. She'd held the count. Not a head lost. Not one. She rode back out of the dark, her horse black with sweat, her hat gone somewhere, her hair down. And the men sat their horses and looked at her, and nobody said a word for a moment. And then old Rafe, the eldest of the 6, the one who'd been slowest to warm, took off his hat to her the way you'd take it off in church. And Cole Buckley, 17 years old, who 3 days back had half believed the town, looked at the woman who'd just ridden into the mouth of death singing and turned it with her bare hands, And something in him settled, permanent, that would never doubt her again as long as he lived. That was the first one. The first degree. There would be more. A dry stretch where the map lied, and she'd read the sign of antelope to find water hidden in the ground, and bring 1,100 head to drink, a night when Corwin's own hired shadows would come to cut cattle off her drag in the dark, and she'd prove whose hand was against her. A river yet to come that had a claim on her that none of them knew. Trust would come to her the way she'd always earned everything, one hard-bought degree at a time. But that night by the settling herd, with the last of the lightning walking away north over the plains, and her hair down around her shoulders, and 10 men and boys looking at her like they'd never truly seen her before, Della Hargrove sat her blowing horse in the dark and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something she had forgotten the shape of. She felt seen. And on the far side of the bedded-down herd, sitting his own horse where she couldn't see him, Amos Ridgeway had watched the whole thing, had watched her go into that black roar, when he'd been sure, sick sure, that he'd sent a woman to her death for his ranch, and had felt his heart do a thing in his chest that had nothing to do with cattle or notes or the 18th of October. He didn't have a word for it yet. He wouldn't let himself. But 200 miles of trail lay ahead of them, and a mountain closing, and a man in a clean coat 2 days back who was not nearly done, and a river with her husband's ghost in it still waiting downstream in the dark. And the truth of why they called her wild, the real truth, the one even Amos didn't know, the one Wick Tanner had almost said over a corral rail and let drop, was still buried where she'd buried it, waiting for the worst possible moment to come up out of the water. Hold on to that. Because it's coming. The snow came to the high country 9 days out, and it came early. Della smelled it before she saw it. There's a taste the air gets when the sky is about to turn on you, a metal taste, flat and cold on the back of the tongue. She sat her horse on a rise above the bedded herd at the gray end of afternoon, and read the clouds coming down off the peaks like a woman reads a letter she already knows the ending of. Amos rode up beside her. He'd learned to do that in the last 2 weeks, to come up quiet and wait, not to fill the silence with talk. That was new for him. She'd noticed. She noticed most things about him now, and hated a little that she did. "Wagon road's 4 days longer than the map swears," he said. "But it's a road. It's a road to a pass that snow's shut behind us," she said. "We take the wagon road, we make Dunmore on the 22nd. 4 days past your note." He was quiet. She watched the cloud come. "There's the Coldwater Cut," she said. She felt him go still. Every hand on that drive had heard of the Coldwater Cut the way boys hear of the devil, a switchback over the shoulder of the mountain that saved 5 days and killed men who trusted it. Wick Tanner had taken it once, 20 years back, and never took it again. "Wick won't cross that with a wagon and 1,100 head," Amos said. "Wick, who's forgot more trail than I'll ever learn." "Wick's got a broke hip in Harlow Crossing," Della said. "And I've got 1,100 head in 8 days. The men had gathered without seeming to. That was the way of it on a drive. Trouble draws them the way a downed steer draws crows, quiet, from the edges. Rafe was there, and Cole, and the others, hats pulled low against the first spitting flakes. Amos looked at them, and then at her, and she watched him do the thing he'd been doing his whole life. She watched him measure himself against what other men would think. "Della," he said, low, for her only. "If you're wrong, if I'm wrong, I lose your ranch for you a little faster than the note would." She did not say it cruel. She said it plain. "And if I take the wagon road, I lose it slow and sure, and we both stand at Dunmore on the 22nd and watch Corwin by your creek. Amos, there's no safe road left. There's only the road I can read and the road I can't." She swung her horse to face the crew. Her hair was under her hat now, braided tight, and the cold had scoured her face down to the bone of it, and she did not look wild. She looked like exactly what she was. "We go over Coldwater," she said. Tonight we rest. First light we climb. Any man who wants the wagon road can have it, and take his wages and go, and I'll think no less of him, and neither will Mr. Ridgeway. But the herd goes up the cut. The herd goes with me. It was not a suggestion. It landed on them like a stone in still water, and the rings of it went out and touched every man there, and not one of them looked to Amos to countermand it. That was the thing. She saw the moment it happened. They looked to her. Cole spoke first, 17 and hoarse with it. "I'm with you, boss." Rafe took his hat off. "Just for a second, the way you do in church." Then he put it back on and said, "Reckon we climb," and turned to see to his horse. Amos sat there in the falling snow while his whole drive chose a woman over him, and Della watched to see what it would do to him. She'd known men it would have broken. She'd known men who'd have taken it out on her in the dark for the rest of the trail. Amos Ridgeway pushed his hat back and looked at the mountain she meant to take his cattle over, and she saw him let go of the last of the town he carried around inside him like a stone in his boot. "You heard your trail, boss," he said. Loud, so they'd all hear it. First light. And that was the moment. Though she'd not have said it, though she'd have swung her quirt at anyone who did, that was the moment Della Hargrove first let herself think a word she'd buried 2 years back with a man in the Sabinaw mud. She looked at Amos Ridgeway backing his ranch and his pride and his good name against her read of the sky, and she thought, there. Then she made herself stop. They climbed for 3 days. It was worse than she'd told them, and she'd told them it would be bad. The cut was a knife's edge of ice above a drop that had no bottom you could see. They lost a horse the second morning. It went over, and the sound it made going down was a thing Cole would hear the rest of his life, and Della held the boy's arm hard and said, "Don't look. Mind the herd. The herd's alive. Mind the living." And he minded the living. At night they made cold camps in the lee of rock, and the frost came so hard it cracked in the trees like gunfire, and the coffee froze in the pot. It was on the second cold night that Amos took his coat off and laid it over her while she slept the 2 hours she let herself sleep, and pretended, when she woke, that he'd done no such thing. She lay still under the weight of it and smelled the smoke and horse and man of it, and did not move for a long time. Then she got up and stood his night watch for him without a word, because she'd seen his eyes and she knew he hadn't slept in 2 days, and she left the coat folded on his saddle where he'd find it, and no she'd known. Neither of them ever spoke of the coat. That was how you said a thing out there. You did not say it. You carried it. The morning of the 3rd day the trail widened onto the long saddle below the summit, and there was grass under the snow, and Della let the herd spread and graze, and let the men and the horses breathe, because from here it was one hard push over the top and down the far slope to Dunmore, and she meant them to have their legs under them for it. And it was there, in that grace of a morning, that the town came out to find her. She saw the rider a long way off, coming up the wagon road they hadn't taken, a soft man on a soft horse with a townsman's seat, and she knew him before she could see his face. Elias Poole, the storekeeper. He'd ridden 200 miles of frozen trail, a man who never rode farther than his own woodpile, and Della felt something go tired and old in her chest at the sight of it, because she knew what a man rides 200 miles in the cold to say. He said it badly. Kind men often do. Della. He got down stiff, and he'd rubbed himself raw in the saddle, and he stood there in the snow with his hat in his 2 hands like a boy. "I got a warm store. I got a good name and no one's ever said a word against it. I got a spare room I'd make a parlor for you, and a whole town that'd have to take back every ugly thing it ever, Elias, if you was Mrs. Poole. There's no shame in quitting a thing that's going to kill you, Della. There's no shame in coming in out of the cold. You've proved whatever it was you set out to prove. Let me give you a roof. Let me give you a name nobody can spit on." She looked at him a long moment. She was not unkind. He was a decent man offering her the one thing the world said a woman like her should crawl to get, and part of her, a small, cold, frightened part she'd never confessed to a living soul, part of her wanted to take it. To come in out of the cold. To be safe. To be respectable. To stop, for once in her life, being the storm everyone braced against. Behind her the herd shifted and blew. 1,100 head that trusted her, and beyond them a man stood by a picket line pretending not to watch. A man who'd laid his coat over her in the dark. "You're offering me a name I can hide behind," Della said. "I already had one of those. I hid a good man behind mine till it near ate me alive. I'm done hiding, Elias. I'd sooner freeze on this mountain doing a thing that's mine than sit warm in a parlor being nobody's ruin." He flinched at the word. Ruin. She hadn't meant to say it. It came up out of her like water out of the ground. And she heard it, and she thought, maybe that's what I am. Maybe that's the true thing, and all the rest is pride. Maybe I am the ruin that follows me. Poole rode off in the afternoon, and the doubt he'd planted stayed, small and cold, and worked its way down into her the way the frost worked down into the ground. She should have watched the boys closer that night. She'd learn that after. The storm came in with the dark, the big one, the one the early snow had only been the outrider of. It came down off the summit in a wall of white and wind that took a man's voice out of his mouth before it reached the man beside him. Della had them ring the herd and hold. No fires, riders doubled, and she rode the line all night with her face iced to numbness, singing when she got close enough to a nervy steer for it to hear her over the wind. It was near the false dawn, that gray dead hour when the storm drew one breath, that Corwin's boy cut the herd loose. His name was Little Pruitt, one of the 4 green ones nobody else would hire. And Corwin had found him back in Harlow Crossing with $40 and a story about a woman who got men killed, and the boy had carried it up the mountain in his coat like a coal. In the gray hour he cut the drag ropes and fired his pistol twice into the belly of the herd, and 1,100 head that had held all night through the storm broke and ran in the dark on a mountain with no bottom to it. After that, it was chaos. And chaos is the same in any language. Men shouting. Horses screaming. The ground itself moving. A rider went down, it was Cole. His horse foundered in a snowmelt ford that the storm had swelled to a black race, and the boy went into the water and under, and Della heard him go, and turned her horse into the dark toward the sound the way she'd turned into the stampede 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. She got a rope on him. She hauled him out blue and coughing onto the ice, and knelt over him in the wind, and it was there, with the herd scattering and a boy near drowned under her hands, that Little Pruitt stood up in the gray and screamed the thing Corwin had bought him to scream. It's her. It's the woman. She's cursed. She got her own husband killed on a drive just like this. She'll drown every man on this mountain. Ask her. Ask her. Ask her whose fault it was Tom Hargrove died in the water. And the wind dropped. Storms do that. They give you one terrible clear moment. Every man who'd made it to the ford stood in that clear moment and looked at her. Amos was there. She saw him through the snow, his chest heaving, blood on his face from a fall she hadn't seen him take, and he was looking at her the way you look at a thing you've decided to believe in and just heard called a lie. She was so tired. That was the thing nobody ever put in the stories. She was so tired, and she was on her knees on the ice, with a boy's life, still coughing under her hands, and 2 years of holding it came up her throat like the river coming up, and she was done. She was just done. So she told it. Tom Hargrove was my husband, and I loved him, she said. Her voice didn't shake. She'd wonder about that after, how a thing that shook her whole life could come out of her level as a table. And Tom Hargrove was afraid of deep water. 12 years I knew it, and 12 years I kept it, because a horsebreaker in this country can't have the men know he's afraid of a river. The wind held its breath. 2 years back, his outfit came to the Sabinaw at flood. 900 head and a river up over its banks, and every man looking to Tom to lead them into it. And Tom Hargrove sat his horse at the edge of that water, and he froze. Not from cowardice. From being a man made of the same stuff as the rest of you, that has one thing in this world that unmans him. And his was moving water. She looked at little Pruitt, and then passed him at all of them. So I took the lead steer's rope out of my husband's hands. And I put my horse in the Sabinaw at flood, and I brought 900 head across that river myself, while Tom Hargrove sat on the bank and shook. Cole had stopped coughing. He was staring up at her. The river took a hand that day. Not Tom. A boy named Fields swept off the drag, and we never found him. And Tom went in after him. Went into the water he was afraid of. Went in for a drag hand he barely knew, because he was ashamed, and he was brave, and both those things killed him at once. Her jaw worked. And the river took Tom too. And I came out the far side with 900 head and no husband, and the town wanted to know how a drive went so wrong, and I had a choice. The snow fell into the silence. I could say it true. I could say Tom froze and I led, and Tom drowned trying to make it right. And the whole county would remember him as the horsebreaker who lost his nerve at the water and got himself killed. Or, she stood up off the ice now, slow, her knees stiff with cold. Or, I could let them call it Tom's drive. Let them say Tom brought 900 head across the Sabinaw and died a hero saving a hand. Let a dead man keep his name. And let them look at me and wonder what kind of woman rides point in a flood and comes out alive when her husband didn't. Let them make up their own ugly story about that. Let them call me wild. She was crying now, and her voice never once broke. And that was the most terrible thing about it. The deacon stood over Tom's coffin, she said, and said God takes the ones who lose their nerve. Said it soft, like scripture. And I took my quirt to him across the church floor, in front of the whole town, because I'd rather they thought me a mad woman than let one of them call my husband a coward over his own box. And they have called me wild ever since. And I have let them. Because the name Tom Hargrove kept me being the one who kept his. She looked at Amos. Only at him now. That's the whole of it. That's the truth. Corwin's been feeding you drop by drop the whole trail to break your faith in me at the worst place he could find. I never got a man killed. I saved every soul but the 2 the river took, and one of those was my own. That's what wild means. It means a woman was loyal in a way the world had no word for, so it reached for the ugliest word it had. The wind came back. It always comes back. And Della Hargrove, standing on the ice with a scattered herd and a broken drive around her, did the thing that cost her more than the river ever had. She reached into her coat, over her heart, where the oilcloth tally book had ridden 200 miles, and she took it out, and she held it out to Amos. They'll finish under you, she said. Not under me. Corwin's poisoned them, and maybe he's right. Maybe I am the ruin that rides ahead of me. And your ranch can't afford my curse, whether it's real or a lie. Take the book. Bring your cattle down. I'll ride out and take the story with me, and you'll make Dunmore clean. She pressed it toward him. It was always going to end this way, Amos. A woman like me doesn't get to keep the good thing. She just gets to hand it back before it breaks. And she set the tally book down on his saddle, where she'd once left his coat folded, and she turned her horse into the snow to gather what she could carry and go. She got maybe 100 yards. She'd found a stretch of rock out of the worst wind, and she'd started, out of pure habit, out of the thing in her that could not stop working even when there was nothing left to work for. She'd started rebuilding a picket line in the dark, driving the pins into the frozen ground with a rock, because her hands needed a thing to do, tying off horses that were still hers to tie until somebody told her they weren't. That's where Amos found her, working, for an outfit that had just watched her offer to leave it. He came out of the snow on foot, leading his horse, snow-blind and stumbling, the tally book in his bare hand. And he didn't say the soft words. She'd have hated him if he'd said the soft words. She'd have known they were pity, and she'd have thrown them back in his teeth. He said, loud. And behind him, she saw, were the men, Rafe and Cole and the others who'd followed him out through the storm to see what he'd do, so that whatever he said he'd say in front of witnesses, you forgot your book. Amos, you're my trail boss. He put it in her hands. He closed her frozen fingers around it with his own. You were the best one in this territory before I ever knew your name. You brought 900 head across the Sabinaw when a grown man froze, and you brought 1,100 up Coldwater in a killing storm, and any man who'll listen to a lie that Corwin bought from a scared boy over the evidence of his own 2 eyes can take his wages right now and walk down off this mountain in the dark. He turned to them. Any takers? Nobody moved. The snow fell on them. I didn't think so, Amos said. Then we've got a herd on the ground and a railhead below us and a note coming due. And I'd be obliged, Mrs. Hargrove, if you'd get my cattle down off this mountain. His voice cracked then, just once, on the last of it. And I'd be obliged if you'd stay. But we'll talk about the second thing when the first thing's done. Della Hargrove stood in the snow with the tally book back over her heart and a whole crew standing behind the man who'd handed it to her, and she did not cry this time. She was empty of it. She looked at the mountain and the scattered herd and the gray coming up in the east that was, this time, the real dawn. Cole, she said. You able to sit a horse? Yes, boss. The boy was already up, wet through and shaking and grinning like a fool. Then let's go find 1,100 head. They found them by full light, bunched in the draws where cattle go to get out of the wind, scattered but not lost, because a herd 3 weeks on the trail wants to be a herd. They gathered them all day, every man riding, Amos taking her orders now the way the greenest boy did. Glad to. They found little Pruitt too, hiding in the rocks, and Della looked at the shaking 17-year-old who'd near killed them all for Corwin's $40, and she did not swing her quirt. You'll ride down with us, she said. And you'll tell the marshal at Dunmore what you did and who paid you to do it. And then, boy, you'll have a name too, but you'll have earned yours, which is more than the man who bought you ever let me do. He told the marshal everything. He was sick with the telling. Guilt does that to the young. It hasn't calloused over yet. They came down the far slope of Coldwater in the last light of the 18th of October. Word had run ahead of them the way it does. A drive coming down off the Killing Pass, a week after every soul in the territory had written it dead, and there were men at the Dunmore station pens to see it. Drovers and buyers and railmen, standing along the rails in the cold to watch 1,100 head come down out of the mountains behind a woman on a wind-broke horse with her braid gone white, with frost. Nobody said a word as she brought them in. There's a silence men keep when they're watching a thing they'll tell their grandchildren about. She heard it, and she paid it no mind, because a gate is a gate and cattle spook at a crowd, and she was working. They penned the last of them as the sun went down. 1,100 head. She counted them into the pens herself, her lips moving, the tally book open in her frozen hand, and when she closed the book on the full count, she sat her horse a moment with her eyes shut, and no one who saw her face will tell you what was on it. Because it was hers. At the buyer's scale house, they read the count aloud off her book against the railroad's own tally, and the 2 numbers matched to the head, which the old buyer said he'd not seen once in 30 years of taking delivery off a mountain drive. And he told the price. And he counted it out onto the plank in gold and green, and it was enough, and it was more than enough. Amos stood beside her and looked at the money and then at her and did not touch it. That's yours to hand over, he said. You brought it. You hand it. So it was Della Hargrove who scooped Amos Ridgeway's cattle money off the plank and put it in the oilcloth bag beside the tally book, over her heart, for the long ride home. They rode into Harlow Crossing on a Sunday. Della would think, later, that God had a sense of humor about Sundays where she was concerned. The whole town was out. It was church out, the street full of good coats and clean collars, the deacon's wife on the steps of the mercantile, where she'd stood 8 months back and said no decent outfit will ride behind her to 40 churchgoers. And here came the outfit, dust and ice on every coat, a green boy and an old hand and a woman at the head of it, and behind them the news that had beaten them into town by 2 days, that the 2 bells had made Dunmore on the 18th, to the day. They did not go to the church. They went to the Alder Valley Stock and Loan. Silas Corwin was at his counter in a clean coat, as he was always in a clean coat, and he looked up as the door opened and the cold came in, and Della watched his courteous face do its courteous work, while behind his eyes something else entirely went to war. "Ridgeway," he said, "you look a hard 60 days." Amos laid the money on the counter. $3,150, counted out in the gold and green off the Dunmore plank. And he laid it down slow, so Corwin could watch every bill of it land. "My note," Amos said. "In full. On the day." Corwin looked at the money a long moment. The town had crowded to the windows. The deacon's wife was in the doorway, 40 churchgoers, or the same 40, breathing the cold and watching the president of the bank look at the money that beat him. "There's paperwork," Corwin began. "Smooth. Interest calculations. The terms provide for." Della set the paid note flat on the ledger in front of him. She'd had it drawn and witnessed by the Dunmore agent, stamped and legal. Nothing for a smooth man to slide a smooth word into. "It's calculated," she said. "It's witnessed. It's paid. You'll mark your ledger, Mr. Corwin, and you'll mark it now, with the town watching, the way you did everything else to us with the town watching." And Silas Corwin's courteous mask cracked. Just at the corner of the mouth, just for the space of a breath. Because the door had opened again behind them, and the Dunmore marshal had come in with little Pruitt by the collar, and the marshal said, plain, "Into that crowded quiet, Mr. Corwin. This boy's give a sworn statement you paid him $40 to scatter a herd on Coldwater Pass and cost a man his ranch. That's a hanging matter if a hand had died, and one near did. You'll want to come with me and talk about it." Corwin did not say anything. That was his fall, and it was a fitting one for a man with a ledger for a heart, not a shout. Not a threat, just a dry, cornered silence while the marshal took his arm, while the town he'd used as his witness turned into the town that witnessed him. He marked the ledger with a shaking hand before they took him out. "Paid in full. It's there in the book still," they say, in a banker's neat hand gone all to pieces on the last word. On the church steps the deacon's wife found her voice. She'd always had a voice. It was the one thing about her a body could count on. She looked at Della coming out of the bank with the paid note in her hand, and she started, the way she'd started 100 times. That wild woman. And Wick Tanner, who'd come down to the street on his crutch to see it, who'd swung 200 yards on a broke hip to be there when it landed, finished it for her. Loud. So, the whole street got it. "Brought 1,100 head over Coldwater in October," Wick said. "With half a crew and a bought trader in it, and a bank against her the whole trail. Call it whatever you want, Mrs. Deacon. I've run trail 40 years, and I call it the best boss this county ever had, and ran off out of pure meanness." He looked around at all of them, the clean coats, the church faces. "Wild, you people wouldn't know Wild from a milk cow. That there's the finest hand in the territory, and every one of you owes her the price of a thing you can't pay back, which is what you said about her when you thought she couldn't hear." And the word lost its sting, right there, in public, on a Sunday. It didn't vanish. Words like that don't vanish, But it turned in the town's mouth from a thing they'd said about her to a thing that had been said, and everyone who heard it knew the difference. And the deacon's wife closed her mouth and did not open it again. Spring came green to the two bells. It came up the creek first, the way it always did. The creek Silas Corwin had wanted so bad and would never own now. He'd sold his bank and his failed ranches at a loss and left the valley by the first thaw, gone off to some other town to be courteous and cruel at, and good riddance was the kindest thing anyone said. Elias Poole married the schoolteacher that spring, a soft, kind match, and he shook Amos Ridgeway's hand at the wedding and meant it, and if there was an old ache under it, he had the grace to keep it his own. At the two bells, the grass came in on the flat 2 miles out, and the 3 horses Della had kept through everything grazed it with a dozen more, and the 1,100 head were a memory sold, and a note paid, and a ranch that would stand another 3 generations if the family in it had anything to say about it. Amos sat at the kitchen table one morning with the oilcloth tally book open in front of him. The window was up, and the creek sound came through it, and the buttery spring light lay on the wood the way it had lain on 1,000 mornings before he ever knew he'd want a particular woman in the room to see it with. Under the last entry, the Dunmore count, the drive closed out, 1,100 head delivered on the 18th of October in the year of the storm, he'd written in his slow hand. Weeks back, trail boss, permanent, now he took the pen, and dipped it, and under that he wrote a second line. Her name, beside his, on the brand. Della came in from the horses with the cold morning on her, and saw him bent over the book, and saw what he'd written, and stood very still in the doorway. Amos Ridgeway was not a man for long words. He'd proved that on a mountain in the snow. He looked up at her, and he said the one word that cost him more than all the long ones put together, the word a proud man says when he's decided to stop measuring himself against anything but the truth in front of him. Stay, he said. And Della Hargrove, widow, horsebreaker, trail boss, the woman a whole town had no word for and reached for its ugliest one to name. Della Hargrove looked at her name written next to his, on the brand her drive had saved, and she stayed. The world had no word for a woman who was loyal past all sense and fearless past all safety and unafraid to lead men who'd been taught since birth that leading wasn't hers to do. So, it called her wild. It threw the word at her like a stone for 2 long years. And the right man just called her his and asked her to stay and let her keep her own hard name into the bargain, because he'd learned on 200 miles of trail that the wildness they'd tried to shame her with was only the size of a heart the town was too small to hold. Out past the window, the new herd moved onto the new grass, and the creek ran down out of the hills that no bank would ever own, and somewhere a long way back, a river still had a good man's ghost in it, but it didn't have her anymore. She'd carried him across at last. She'd set him down clean. If you've ever loved someone the whole world was too small to understand, tell me the name of the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this story traveled.